Imagine a Europe on edge, a continent tied together by fragile alliances, where one wrong move could ignite a devastating conflict. It's 1914, and Europe is a powder keg, its nations bound by treaties of defense, honor, and distrust. Each country believes it's ready for war, but no one is truly prepared for the catastrophic chain reaction that's about to unfold. The story of World War I didn't begin with trenches or tanks. It began in the meeting rooms of diplomats and monarchs, where promises were made and alliances signed. The intricate web of these alliances, formed over decades, would soon entangle entire nations. Take Germany, for example. Unified in 1871, it had rapidly become Europe's military powerhouse. By 1914, it had expanded its military spending by 73% and was forging powerful alliances with Austria-Hungary and Italy, forming what became known as the Triple Alliance. Across the continent, France, Russia, and Britain strengthened their ties through the Triple Entente, suspicious of Germany's ambitions. But alliances can be both a shield and a sword. They bound nations together in a dance of diplomacy that, by 1914, had turned into a death spiral. One spark, just one, could set off a war that would pull every major power into the conflict. That spark would come on a quiet street in Sarajevo, with 2 gunshots fired by a 19-year-old nationalist named Gavrilo Princip. Little did he know, his actions would ignite the deadliest conflict the world had ever seen. How did Europe's alliances, designed to prevent war, become the chains that pulled nations into battle? Let's unravel the story behind the alliances that fueled the Great War. Alliances weren't a new concept in Europe. Since the 18th century, nations have been forming and breaking alliances, often to balance power and avoid domination by one single state. However, the alliances that shaped Europe by 1914 were very different from the shifting coalitions of the past. The seeds were planted after the Napoleonic Wars, when the major powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, joined forces to ensure peace through the Quadruple Alliance of 1815. This alliance, along with the Holy Alliance between Russia, Austria, and Prussia, was designed to maintain order in Europe by suppressing revolutions and preventing the rise of any new Napoleonic figure. Over time, the Concert of Europe emerged, where the great powers worked together to manage European affairs. But as the 19th century progressed, this cooperation began to fray. The rise of nationalism, the decline of the Ottoman Empire, and new territorial ambitions, especially in the Balkans, led to growing tension. The first major blow to the old system came with the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, which pitted Russia against an alliance of Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire. This war marked the beginning of the end for the post-Napoleonic balance of power. The unification of Germany in 1871 under Bismarck fundamentally altered the landscape. With the creation of a powerful German empire, the balance of power tipped in the favor of the new nation, which quickly sought to secure its position in Europe. Bismarck, ever the skilled diplomat, sought to maintain peace by isolating France and forming alliances with Austria-Hungary and Russia through the Triple Emperors League in 1873. However, conflicts over the Balkans caused this alliance to fracture, and by the late 19th century, Europe was divided into 2 major alliance systems: the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, and the Triple Entente, France, Russia, and Britain. These alliances, intended to prevent war, would soon become the very mechanisms that dragged the entire continent into conflict. The formation of the Dual and Triple Alliances. The creation of the Dual and Triple Alliances began in the aftermath of Germany's unification in 1871. With Germany emerging as a powerful force in Europe, Otto von Bismarck, its chancellor, sought to secure Germany's position. He knew that France, humiliated by its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War, would seek revenge. To prevent France from gaining allies, Bismarck forged the Dual Alliance with Austria-Hungary in 1879. This defensive pact ensured that if Russia attacked either nation, the other would provide military support. This was followed by the addition of Italy in 1882, creating the Triple Alliance. Italy's inclusion was primarily motivated by its desire for support in the event of conflict with France, as tensions between the two nations grew over colonial ambitions in North Africa. Though this alliance seemed strong, Italy's loyalty remained uncertain, especially as its interests increasingly clashed with Austria-Hungary's in the Balkans and the Mediterranean. Bismarck's strategy with the Triple Alliance was to isolate France diplomatically while ensuring Germany had powerful allies on its eastern and southern borders. However, tensions within the alliance persisted. Italy had long-standing territorial disputes with Austria-Hungary, particularly over the regions of Trentino and South Tyrol, which were home to many Italian speakers but controlled by Austria-Hungary. Despite these conflicts, Italy remained part of the alliance due to its fear of French aggression, which had been highlighted by France's occupation of Tunisia in 1881. However, after Bismarck's dismissal in 1890, Germany's careful diplomacy began to unravel. His successors struggled to manage the delicate balance between Austria-Hungary and Russia, particularly as Russian influence in the Balkans grew. By 1907, Europe was divided between two powerful blocs, the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente, setting the stage for the major confrontation that would come in 1914. The key players: Kaiser Wilhelm II, Tsar Nicholas II, Franz Joseph I, King George V. At the heart of Europe's growing tensions was the ambitions and decisions of its leaders. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the German emperor, was perhaps the most aggressive of them all. Ascending to the throne in 1888, Wilhelm wanted to make Germany a dominant global power, particularly through naval expansion. His decision to build a navy to rival Britain's Royal Navy deeply unsettled Britain and set off a naval arms race. He also alienated Russia by allowing the reinsurance treaty to lapse in 1890, pushing Russia closer to France. Wilhelm's impulsive and militaristic policies helped isolate Germany diplomatically, driving it deeper into its alliance with Austria-Hungary. In contrast, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was far more hesitant and unsure in his leadership. Ruling a vast and diverse empire, Nicholas struggled to modernize Russia while maintaining his automatic power. He saw himself as the protector of the Slavic peoples, particularly Serbia, and felt obligated to support them against Austria-Hungary's aggression. However, Nicholas's indecisiveness during the July crisis of 1914, when he hesitated before ordering full mobilization against Austria-Hungary, added to the chaotic escalation that led to war. Russia's alliance with France and its perceived role as a defender of Slavic interests would pull it into a conflict it wasn't fully prepared to fight. Meanwhile, Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary, one of Europe's longest reigning monarchs, faced a much different challenge. His empire, a patchwork of ethnicities and nationalities, was on the brink of disintegration, driven by nationalist movements within his borders. Franz Joseph's primary goal was to preserve the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was increasingly threatened by Serbian nationalism. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand, his heir, was assassinated in 1914, Franz Joseph saw it as a direct challenge to his empire's authority. His decision to issue an ultimatum to Serbia, with Germany's backing, would set the wheels of war in motion. In Britain, King George V found himself reluctantly drawn into the escalating conflict. Unlike his continental counterparts, George V's role was largely symbolic. Britain's policies were shaped more by its parliament and foreign ministers. However, Britain's commitment to maintaining the balance of power in Europe, along with its guarantee to protect Belgium's neutrality, made its entry into the war inevitable. Germany's invasion of Belgium in August 1914 was the final straw. Britain declared war, and with it, the global scope of the conflict was set. Though Britain had hoped to avoid entangling itself in a European war, it couldn't ignore the threat posed by an increasingly aggressive Germany. Escalating tensions, the Moroccan and Bosnian crises, and the Balkan Wars. In the years leading up to 1914, Europe was plagued by a series of diplomatic crises that heightened tensions between the major powers, particularly Germany, France, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. These events didn't just strain relations, they actively pushed Europe closer to the brink of war. The first major test of European diplomacy came in 1905, during the First Moroccan Crisis. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, sought to challenge France's influence in Morocco by declaring its support for Moroccan independence. The move was a calculated attempt to disrupt the growing friendship between France and Britain, solidified by the Entente Cordiale in 1904. Wilhelm's actions, however, backfired. Instead of weakening the alliance, Germany's interference only pushed France and Britain closer together. At the Algeciras Conference in 1906, Germany found itself diplomatically isolated, with only Austria-Hungary supporting its stance. A few years later, in 1911, Germany would try again during the Second Moroccan Crisis, sending a gunboat Panther to the port of Agadir in response to France's military presence in Morocco. This gunboat diplomacy escalated the situation further. Once again, Germany's aggressive tactics only strengthened the resolve of the Entente, as Britain and France stood united against what they saw as German provocation. At the same time, tensions were rising in the Balkans. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories it had occupied since 1878. This act outraged Serbia, which had its own ambitions in the region, and Russia, which saw itself as a protector of Slavic nations. The Bosnian crisis brought Europe dangerously close to war, with Austria-Hungary and Germany on one side and Russia and Serbia on the other. Though war was narrowly avoided through diplomacy, the crisis left deep scars, particularly in Russia, which felt humiliated by its inability to protect its Slavic ally, Serbia. This humiliation would not be forgotten when tensions flared again in 1914. These two crises, Morocco and Bosnia, highlighted how fragile Europe's alliance system had become. Each incident added fuel to the growing animosity between the major powers. While the diplomatic efforts of the early 1900s managed to keep war at bay, the cracks in the system were beginning to show. The idea that alliances would prevent war was quickly being overshadowed by the reality that they were making it more likely. While the Moroccan and Bosnian crises revealed the fragility of European diplomacy, the situation in the Balkans was a tinderbox ready to explode. By the early 1910s, the Balkans had become the focus of fierce competition between Austria-Hungary, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire. In 1912, a coalition of Balkan states, including Serbia, Bulgaria, Greece, and Montenegro, launched the First Balkan War to drive the Ottomans out of Europe. The war ended with a decisive victory for the Balkan League, which nearly expelled the Ottoman Empire from the region. However, the victory was short-lived. Disputes over the spoils of war soon led to the Second Balkan War in 1913. This time, pitting Bulgaria against its former allies, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, with the support of Romania and the Ottomans. The outcome of this war strengthened Serbia, making it a significant regional power. Austria-Hungary, alarmed by Serbia's growing influence, became increasingly determined to curb Serbian ambitions. The Balkan Wars were critical in shaping the events that would lead to World War I. Serbia's successes in the Balkans were seen as a direct threat by Austria-Hungary, which feared that a strong, independent Serbia, backed by Russia, would destabilize its empire. For Austria-Hungary, crushing Serbia became a priority, and by 1914 it was actively looking for a reason to go to war with its southern neighbour. For Russia, the Balkan Wars were equally significant. Russia had long viewed itself as the defender of Slavic nations, particularly Serbia, and saw Austrian interference in the Balkans as a challenge to its influence. The wars also revived Russian fears of being diplomatically isolated and weakened, especially after the humiliation of the Bosnian crisis. The result was a deepening commitment to Serbia and a stronger resolve to stand against Austria-Hungary even at the risk of war. These escalating tensions between Austria-Hungary, Serbia and Russia set the stage for the events of 1914. By the time Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in Sarajevo, both Austria-Hungary and Russia had already decided that the next crisis in the Balkans would not be solved through diplomacy. The alliance system ensured that once these two powers clashed, the rest of Europe would be drawn into the conflict. The Central Powers: Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. At the heart of the Central Powers were three nations: Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy. While they were bound together by the Triple Alliance, each had distinct motivations, and their relationships were fraught with tension. Understanding these differences is key to understanding how their alliance functioned and why it eventually crumbled during World War I. Germany, the most dominant of the Central Powers, was the industrial and military powerhouse of Europe. Following its unification in 1871 under Otto von Bismarck, Germany had rapidly risen to become the continent's most formidable force. Bismarck's foreign policy was one of careful diplomacy. He aimed to maintain Germany's position by forming strategic alliances and keeping France diplomatically isolated. However, after Bismarck's dismissal in 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II took a more aggressive approach. Wilhelm's ambitious plans, including naval expansion, worried Britain, while his support for Austria-Hungary in the Balkans put Germany on a collision course with Russia. Austria-Hungary, in contrast, was an empire in decline, held together by an aging monarch, Franz Joseph I. The empire was a patchwork of ethnic groups, many of whom were pushing for greater autonomy or independence, particularly the Slavs in the Balkans. Serbia, a growing Slavic power, posed a direct threat to Austria-Hungary's stability, especially after its victories in the Balkan Wars. Austria-Hungary's leadership believed that crushing Serbia was essential for maintaining the empire, and it was this belief that pushed Austria-Hungary to issue an ultimatum to Serbia following the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. However, Austria-Hungary lacked the military strength to confront Russia and Serbia on its own, relying heavily on Germany's support. Italy, the third member of the Triple Alliance, had a much more tenuous relationship with its allies. While Italy had joined the alliance in 1882, its goals were often at odds with those of Germany and Austria-Hungary. Italy had its own territorial ambitions, particularly in the Mediterranean and Northern Africa, where it clashed with France. Additionally, Italy had unresolved disputes with Austria-Hungary over territories in the Alps, such as Trentino and South Tyrol, which were both home to Italian-speaking populations. Italy's participation in the Triple Alliance was often seen as pragmatic rather than loyal, and by 1914, Italy's commitment to the alliance was already wavering. The Allies: France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Opposite the Central Powers stood the Allies: France, Russia, and the United Kingdom. Though not bound by a formal military alliance like the Triple Alliance, these nations were linked through the Triple Entente, a series of diplomatic agreements aimed at countering the growing power of Germany and its allies. Each of the allied nations had its own reasons for joining the conflict, shaped by both historical grievances and geopolitical interests. France: the wound of Alsace-Lorraine and the desire for security. For France, the roots of this alliance with Russia and the UK lay in its defeat during the Franco-Prussian War, 1870 to 1871, which resulted in the loss of the provinces of Alsace-Lorraine to Germany. This defeat left a deep scar on the French psyche, fostering a strong desire for revenge and the return of these territories. By 1914, France had rebuilt its military and was determined to protect itself from another home invasion. Its military strategy, Plan 17, was centered on a swift offensive against Germany, with the ultimate goal of recovering Alsace-Lorraine. France's alliance with Russia was formalized in 1894, driven by mutual fears of Germany. Both nations understood that a united front was necessary to counter the growing strength of the German Empire. When war broke out in 1914, France knew that it would be fighting on two fronts: against Germany in the west and Austria-Hungary in the east, and it relied heavily on Russian support to divide the Central Powers' attention. Russia, the protector of Slavic nations and the quest for influence. Russia's involvement in the war was driven by its long-standing role as the self-proclaimed protector of Slavic nations, particularly Serbia, and its rivalry with Austria-Hungary in the Balkans. After the humiliation of the Bosnian crisis in 1908, where Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina without significant Russian opposition, Russia became more determined than ever to assert its influence in the region. The Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913, further heightened tensions as Russia saw Austria-Hungary's interference in the Balkans as a direct challenge to its power. Tsar Nicholas II's decision to support Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914 was both an act of solidarity with the fellow Slavic nation and a strategic move to counter Austrian dominance in the region. Russia's massive army, though slow to mobilize, was seen as a key asset of the Allies, as it would force Germany to fight on two fronts, stretching its resources thin. The United Kingdom, protecting Belgium and maintaining the balance of power. Britain's entry into the war was less about territorial ambitions and more about maintaining the balance of power in Europe and protecting Belgium. For much of the 19th century, Britain had followed a policy of splendid isolation, avoiding entangling alliances while focused on its vast colonial empire. However, by the early 20th century, Germany's growing naval power and aggressive foreign policy were seen as direct threats to British interests. The Entente Cordiale of 1904, which resolved colonial disputes between France and Britain, marked a turning point in British foreign policy. This agreement, followed by the 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention, brought Britain into closer alignment with France and Russia, though it stopped short of a formal military alliance. When Germany invaded Belgium in August 1914, violating its neutrality, Britain had little choice but to declare war in defense of its treaty obligations and to prevent Germany from dominating the continent. Though France, Russia and Britain each had their own reasons for entering the war, their combined strength was formidable. France brought its highly motivated military, determined to avenge past defeats. Russia, with its massive population, could mobilize vast armies, albeit slowly. Britain, with its powerful navy and global reach, could control the seas and cut off vital supplies to the Central Powers. Together, these nations formed a coalition that, despite initial setbacks, would eventually turn the tide of war. The arms race and militarization. By the early 20th century, Europe was in the midst of an unprecedented arms race. The major powers were preparing for a conflict they saw as inevitable, each vying to outdo the other in terms of military strength. Between 1900 and 1914, military spending in Europe skyrocketed. For example, Germany increased its military budget by 73%, while other nations followed suit, modernizing their armies and navies in preparation for a war that seemed increasingly likely. One of the most striking aspects of this arms race was the naval rivalry between Britain and Germany. Britain had long prided itself on having the world's most powerful navy, essential for protecting its vast empire. However, Kaiser Wilhelm II was determined to challenge British naval supremacy. In 1906, Britain launched the revolutionary HMS Dreadnought, the first modern battleship of its kind. This sparked a naval arms race, as Germany responded by building its own fleet of Dreadnought-class ships. By 1914, both nations had significantly expanded their fleets, further increasing tensions between them. On land, the major powers focused on expanding their armies and developing new technologies. Germany, with its highly efficient military machine, developed strategies such as the Schlieffen Plan, designed to quickly defeat France in the west, before turning to face Russia in the east. Meanwhile, France and Russia worked to strengthen their own forces. France reintroduced conscription to bolster its army, while Russia, though slower to modernize, built a vast force that would become a key part of Allied strategy. This arms race generated a sense of urgency among the European powers. The belief was that whoever mobilized first would have a crucial advantage. The result was a militarized Europe, where war plans are drawn up well in advance, and each country stood ready to strike at the first sign of conflict. The alliances and rivalries that had defined European diplomacy were now backed by vast armies and fleets, making the prospect of a large-scale war not just possible, but likely. How alliances fueled the Great War. As we've explained, the intricate system of alliances in Europe designed to preserve peace instead laid the groundwork for widespread conflict. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, alliances turned what could have been a localized event into a global catastrophe. Germany was bound to support Austria-Hungary through the dual alliance, while Russia felt an obligation to defend Serbia. France, committed to its alliance with Russia, mobilized against Germany, and Britain was drawn in due to its obligation to protect Belgium's neutrality. The alliance system worked like a chain reaction. Each country's involvement triggered another, and so on. Nations that had no direct stake in the Balkans found themselves at war. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, for example, was based on the assumptions that a war with Russia would also mean a war with France. So, when Germany declared war on Russia, it simultaneously declared war on France, even though the initial conflict was in the Balkans. Britain's entry into the war, after Germany violated Belgium's neutrality, solidified the global scale of the conflict. The alliances created a sense of security, but also rigidity. Once the wheels were set in motion, diplomacy had little chance of stopping the war. Nations were pulled into the conflict not necessarily because they wanted to, but because their alliances left them with no choice. What started as a localized conflict spiraled into the Great War, pulling in not just European colonies, but nations across the globe. By 1918, millions had died, and the world was forever changed. The lesson of the alliances is clear. When nations lock themselves into rigid commitments, even small sparks could ignite devastating wars. It's a sobering reminder of how interconnected global politics can be, and how delicate the balance of power truly is. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the intricate web of alliances that led to World War I. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more in-depth history content. Let us know in the comments what other historical corridors you'd like to explore. Until next time, let's keep learning from the past to shape a better future.